Thank you so much for the invitation. I really appreciate it and I'm humbled by it. So today I'm going to talk to you, like she mentioned, a little bit about the MD PhD program. And so the title of my talk is Changing the Practice of Medicine and Why Might You Want to Consider Doing an MD PhD. So as an overview, today I'm going to talk about before I became a Gator, my time while I was an undergrad at UF, the MD PhD program overall, why I did it and why you might want to consider it, and then potential role models that also went through MD PhD programs. So before UF, I grew up in Sanford, Florida, so it's about 2 hours south of here, an hour north of Orlando. It was a pretty nice place to grow up, kind of middle of suburbia, and there I went to Seminole High School. And while growing up there, I became interested in science, as many people. I was interested in science kind of in middle school and through high school. And when you think science, you can become a scientist. However, I didn't actually know what that meant. I had a premature idea of what it meant to become a scientist. Really, there's not that much exposure to scientists in high school or even in the media. Really, the only idea of scientists I had was Dexter's Laboratory or the Big Bang Theory. And even at the time, they weren't quite cool yet. So I didn't have, I guess, a good idea of what it meant to be a scientist at the time. So I pursued something else. So the idea of becoming a physician. Fortunately, my family has a lot of members who are in medicine. So I have nurses, occupational therapists, a lot of missionaries in my family, and so the idea of serving people really attracted me, and I felt like it was in my blood as well. And so it seemed like a great fit to be able to pursue the path to become a physician. So I applied to UF. I fortunately was able to get in, and I would say I was a typical pre-med student. You know, they tell you to do volunteering, tell you to do some leadership, do some shadowing as well, and I did all that. And they also tell you it's a good idea to do some research to get into medical school. It seems like a good fit for me since I was interested in science. And so I pursued trying to do some research, again, to just get exposure and to also help my application. I was interested at the time in becoming a surgeon, not just because of Grey's Anatomy, but because I was also interested in working with my hands. I was active in a lot of sports, and so to me it kind of fit that I would be able to help people through working with my hands. So with those two ideas, I pursued a research lab in surgery. So I worked under Dr. Scott Berselli, and he's a vascular surgeon, also an MD PhD, and his research is in vascular biology, and he works with the idea of vein bypass graft failure. So his overall research mission is to improve the understanding of intimal hyperplasia, and then hopefully through this understanding he can find applications to improve long-term outcomes and durability of these vein grafts. And so that idea really attracted me, and I was able to learn a little bit more about surgery and as well get my feet wet in the lab and learn more about research as well. So my undergraduate project, I apologize if it's a little hard to see, but I primarily did immunohistochemistry. So my primary stain was a stain called BRDU, and this is a stain which pretty much you can find cells which are proliferating. So we're interested in cellular proliferation because Dr. Berselli is interested in neo-intimal hyperplasia, so the idea that cells are growing in the intima. And so I performed so many stains. And unfortunately, I did become a little discouraged because it required so much troubleshooting, just hours and hours of trying to figure out what conditions were right, how long to leave something in the bath for. And so I was a little bit discouraged about research at the time because it didn't seem like I was going anywhere. I was just pretty much just doing stains during my free time. And it wasn't until I presented my research at a symposium that I realized kind of what research meant, and it kind of enlightened me to what the potential of research could do. So I always encourage any undergrad to present their research for a couple of reasons. One, you get practice in communicating, so that's a skill that you need pretty much in any career, as well as communicating in science is quite difficult, at least for me, and so getting the practice to do that, I really appreciated the chance to do that as an undergrad. And the second thing, I think with presenting your research, you get exposure to actually other medical research. So I was kind of in my silo, you know, doing stains, just in vascular biology, and I got to see some other posters and realize kind of the breadth of medical research, that there was health outcomes research, that there was other stains that could be done. And so I really appreciated that opportunity to be able to just kind of get the full scope of what medical research could entail. And then I also learned through the presentation that you can actually participate in changing the paradigm of medicine. So even though I was just doing stains continuously, if I thought a little bit further about its applications and its being able to help patients and reduce vein graft bypass failure, then it excited me a little bit, in the sense that I was actually participating in how medical practice could be changed. So I certainly encourage you to present your research. If not getting these realizations, it's just a good thing to be able to practice communicating science overall. So having kind of the bug in wanting to change the practice of medicine, I pursued that further, although I took what some might consider a detour. So this is Huff Hall. So this is pretty much where the graduate business students go to class and whatnot. And it might be considered a detour, but I felt like it was actually a great experience to do this. So I did a program called the Masters in Management. I always thought that the business, since I was always in science, I always thought that business was just this mysterious thing that I never really had exposure to. In fact, I overheard a conversation from another student talking about economics, and it sounded fascinating. And so trying to kind of think through, oh, what does the economics of healthcare look like? And once I started looking into this further, I realized, well, there's actually quite a lot of inefficiencies in healthcare, and so being able to get sort of a foundation in business might help me to be able to kind of understand these things and become a better physician. And so I decided to pursue the program, and so I did a master's in management, and I definitely don't regret it. It's helped shape how I think of problems today, and I definitely don't consider it a detour as some might. So through doing that program and kind of trying to prep my application and thinking through things, I kind of thought through what my priorities are. It's kind of easy to get lost in everything. With medical applications, they ask for so much, often it feels like, and there's so many things you can possibly do, like while you're an undergrad. And so I really had to sit down and focus and think, okay, what are my priorities? And it's okay to change priorities, but I wanted to focus on these and use these as how I make my decisions. So the first thing, for me, faith is very important. So for me, my personal belief is that God put us on this planet for a reason. Each of us has a purpose. And so for me, trying to understand what my purpose was and trying to use that to guide what decisions I made for my career. Second is family. So family is very important to me as well. And so using them kind of as a guiding point and making sure that I was able to prioritize them regardless of what I do. So if something comes up with them, I would be able to, put that thing down and go take care of family at the time. And so that's something that has also driven some of my decisions. The third thing, and that's the thing I realized through the management program and doing more reading and more self-learning, is that I was interested in fixing medical practice. So originally I wanted to become a physician to treat patients and being able to take care of patients. But I realized I was a little more interested in being able to fix how medicine was practiced. And so using that again as a point for my decisions. And then lastly, surprisingly, food actually dictates how I make my decisions. So sometimes depending on what workshops I go to or what seminars I go to, this hasn't steered me wrong yet. So I really appreciate food, and it continues to stay a part of my priorities.
I didn't know that.
So thinking of all of that, and again, I told you I did some reading and trying to understand what I was interested in trying to fix with healthcare. So over time, I was exposed to certain issues with how medicine is practiced. So I'll talk about these reasons. So the first thing, a limited understanding of disease. So in high school and sometimes even undergrad, things are put very clear-cut. So it makes it sound like we have science all figured out, everything is ABC, and we know what's going on. And so trying to understand a little bit more about the nuances of what's going on. For example, we know that smoking can cause lung cancer, but what's not known is, are there certain genes that can protect you or help you reduce the susceptibility to cancer? Or are there certain environmental conditions or exposures that might make one protected for getting lung cancer? And so there's just these certain nuances and things that we still don't understand about things that we think we've known forever. And so that was something that I was attracted to with the idea of fixing medical practice and research. The second thing is that there was significant disparities in disease prevalence. So I took a class and it kind of exposed me to some of the disparities in access to healthcare, and it just astounded me how different we can have prevalences among different groups such as Hispanics and African Americans and Caucasians, and so that really intrigued me that we can have so many differences between groups. The third thing, and this is the thing that bothered me the most actually, was the slow translation of research. So there's all these great research ideas being done at the bench and great clinical trials being done. But I read something that said on average it takes about 17 years from when that research was done to actually being implemented in clinical practice. 17 years, like that number bothered me quite a bit. There's all these great things being done, and yet patients of this generation maybe won't be able to experience that benefit. And so I am still interested in trying to figure out how to speed up this process. And this introduced me to the field called implementation science. So the idea of efficiently being able to bring these new evidence into clinical practice a bit more quicker. So that's something that still drives me to this day. And then lastly, I was also exposed to the amount of waste in healthcare. So actually recently an article came out in JAMA that showed that 25% of healthcare spending is considered waste. And that's billions of dollars. It's billions of dollars that we could use for other services and helping other people. And so that's also something that kind of bothers me that I think can be fixed with medical practice. Figuring out how to make it more efficient so that we can reduce the waste and improve outcomes in patients overall. So with that, I was set on trying to figure out how I can change the paradigm of medical practice. And I figured out that doing an MD PhD program would teach me how to do medical research so that I can better understand how to discover problems, learn about problems, and actually solve the problems through training and research. So a little bit more about what field I decided to go in. I think that I could make the biggest impact through the 4 things I mentioned, through cardiovascular disease. So you can see here, this is a table that was shown or reported by the World
Health Organization. And you see the top 10 global causes of death in the year 2000. The top cause is ischemic heart disease. And over time, we do have medical improvements. And so taken with the year 2016, you can see that the chart has changed quite a bit, but still at the top of the chart is ischemic heart disease. And so heart disease continues to play a role and is a problem globally. And not just globally, it's also in the United States, it's a major problem. So the top cause of death is usually kind of wrestling between heart disease and cancer. But I still am interested in trying to improve cardiovascular diseases. Also with cardiovascular diseases, that's where we see some of the greatest disparities, again, something I'm interested in. So you can see here, the CDC has an infographic that says African Americans are more likely to die at earlier ages from all causes. And some of the things that attribute to this is the differences in prevalence of cardiovascular disease. So you can see here high blood pressure, diabetes, and stroke. And for essentially most of these categories, African Americans have the highest prevalence of these diseases. And so I felt like this is something that if I look through cardiovascular disease, I could also make an impact with health disparities. So the other thing that I learned that could help me address those 4 things that I'm interested in pursuing is the idea of precision medicine. So a while back during the Obama administration, he essentially gave a speech that was addressing something called the Precision Medicine Initiative. And so I'll just read a quote. So, doctors have always recognized that every patient is unique, and doctors have always tried to tailor their treatments as best they can to individuals. You can match a blood transfusion to a blood type. That was an important discovery. What if matching a cancer cure to our genetic code was just as easy, just as standard? What if figuring out the right dose of medicine was as simple as taking our temperature? So reading that and listening to him give the State of the Union address about this initiative, it really inspired me and realized if I pursue this field, I could actually address some of the things I was talking about as well. So for example, figuring out the right dose of medicine. So if we're able to give the right dose at the right time, then we would be able to reduce adverse events, for example. And so we would be able to reduce some of the issues with spending. We'd be able to improve care overall. So I thought that that precision medicine would be a great field to pursue. Something a little bit further, so you can see why I'm in the genetics program. So this is the idea that currently we treat patients usually as an average. So based on evidence-based medicine, we consider patients as a whole and on average. But we can use certain pieces of information. So in this graphic, they highlight omics data, so genomics, so the idea of variation in one's DNA, transcriptomics, the idea of variation in gene expression. So using these omics, we can better categorize patients. And we can either use it using one of these or a multitude of these. And we can figure out through those markers what patients would benefit from which drug. So you can see here, for example, this patient would better, or these set of patients would do better on this therapy based on the certain omics information. And so I was interested in pursuing genetics and genomics so that I can better understand kind of how this works and try to apply this to clinical care. So fortunately, I was able to find a group at UF that did this. And so for my MD PhD, I'm currently working with this group, the Center for Pharmacogenomics and Precision Medicine. So this is my mentor on your left, and her name is Dr. Larissa Cavallari, and she is a pioneer in the field of pharmacogenomics and precision medicine. And what led me to her is her initial research when she came to UF, looking at pharmacogenomics applied to cardiac stents. So the idea that we can improve outcomes in patients by understanding which drugs work better for them after they've received a cardiac stent. And so that idea just blew me away. And so I had to join this lab as best as possible. Unfortunately, they accepted me. So I've been doing research with them for my graduate work. So for my graduate work, I'm working on two things primarily. The first thing, so I'm trying to apply precision medicine to heart failure. I'm working on a particular heart failure that's called heart failure with preserved ejection fraction, because this particular type of heart failure doesn't have as many therapies available to them. And so I'm trying to apply the idea of precision medicine. So these are different things you can add, but I'm particularly looking at omics and health systems data to be able to find a particular phenotype of patients that benefit from a drug called spironolactone. And so ideally, I can find a particular phenotype of patients that will benefit from this drug, improving outcomes in these patients, and not exposing other patients to the risk of spironolactone. For example, this drug can cause hyperkalemia, and we wouldn't want to expose patients to this risk if they weren't going to benefit from the drug in the first place. So that's one thing that I'm working on during grad school. And hopefully in the future from this work, we will be able to incorporate this into electronic health systems. So the idea that if a physician wants to prescribe this drug to patients in the electronic health record, some notification will pop up saying, maybe this drug isn't great for the patient, or maybe you should prescribe this drug to the patient, or maybe we should change the dosage. So hopefully, from my research, we can start to generate outcomes like that in the electronic health record. So the second thing I'm working on is the idea, so genotype by discrimination interactions associated with blood pressure in the Jackson Heart study. So genotype by discrimination interactions. So I spoke earlier about how genetics can play a role into precision medicine, but there are actually other components that can play a role in someone's health. So in this infographic, you can see here that genetics can help determine risk. Lifestyle is associated with one's behavior, and environment and exposure. They all play a role in how someone essentially how their health is. And so these things can also interact with each other, although this isn't as well understood, but it is a growing field trying to understand, for example, genetics by environment interactions. So I'm particularly interested in genetic by discrimination interactions because I'm looking in a population. The Jackson Heart study is a population of African Americans, and so African Americans tend to report more levels of discrimination. And so the idea that discrimination could potentially affect one's risk and can influence one's own genetic susceptibility, that's something I'm interested in learning in blood pressure. I mentioned also earlier that hypertension is prevalent in African Americans. And so by better understanding the mechanisms behind blood pressure, we can hopefully improve this disparity that we see with hypertension in these patients. So with that being said, so why do an MD PhD? So Dr. Brass, he's an MSDP or MD PhD program director at the University of Pennsylvania, and he spends a lot of time trying to convince people why is an MD PhD program so great and why you might want to consider it. So what he says in a journal article, and I quoted it here, MD PhD trainees are being prepared for careers in which they will spend most of their time doing research or translating that research into new therapeutic and diagnostic approaches. So you can see in this quote a bit of what I was interested in. So I'm interested in translating that research and making sure I can apply it to patients. So MD PhDs can essentially do basic research, or they can work on translating this research into patients. And this brings up the idea of translational research. So just to give a background, there is a spectrum of translational research that can be done. we typically start at T0. T0 is the form of basic science, so what you might be most familiar with, animal studies, in vitro studies. So this is considered the foundation and the basic science that occurs. And so this research then has to be translated. So we have essentially 4 types of translation that can occur. And the first one, translation to human, this is often first in human trials. So once we have something in T0, we then have to see if it works in humans, if it's safe in humans. So that's T1. For T2, that's the translation to patients. So once we see if, let's say, a drug is safe in humans, then we translate it to patients who actually have the disease to see if it's efficacious. So that's typically a phase 2 or phase 3 clinical trial. So, so physician scientists can contribute in that sense. There's T3, so this is translation to practice. This is a bit what I mentioned earlier with the idea of implementation science. So the idea that we can learn how to implement these findings into medical practice. Some people assume that once the research is done, then automatically it's accepted into medical practice, but unfortunately, or fortunately, that's not true. There has to be a certain amount of physicians that uptake a practice, and then we have evidence-based guidelines, and so there's the idea that we have to learn how to apply this to medical practice. And then lastly, we have T4, so the translation into populations. So this is more like epidemiology and more population health type research. So this is the idea that once we have all of these things settled and we realize that it's good for patients and it can be implemented in a clinical practice, then we want to see if we can translate it to multiple groups, to the wide scale population. And ideally, we can improve public health and improve outcomes in as many patients as possible. So that's kind of the spectrum of translational research. And you have people, scientists as well as physician scientists working on all parts of the spectrum, also kind of cross-talking between these parts of the spectrum. And so this is just something that I was interested in learning about because, again, I wanted to make sure that I could apply my research and making sure that it was translated into patients, applied into patients. So just a brief overview of what an MD-PhD program is. So this is the MD-PhD program at Wisconsin. Thank you, Wisconsin. They had a great figure. So first, you would do your preclinical med school coursework. So that's typically where you learn pathology, histology, pretty much all the basic coursework that a traditional medical student would go through. And after that, depending on the school, you would go through clinical rotations. So at Wisconsin, apparently they do 12 months of clinical rotations right after that. At UF, we actually defer this 12-month rotation to after graduate school is done, so it varies depending on the school. So this PhD research and coursework, this could be anything depending on the school. You can have it in, the traditional biomedical sciences, so physiology, genetics. You can also do it in sociology, anthropology, public health, epidemiology. And so depending on what school you go to, whatever program is available, you can essentially pursue your PhD in whatever your passion is and however you want to make the impact on medicine. And so, again, I mentioned most schools have their clinical rotations after the PhD, but there is some variation. So once you finish that, you defend your thesis, and then you go to what's called the 4th year of medical school, where you do internships and electives, so where you try to figure out what kind of clinician you want to be. And so most schools let you kind of experiment with whether you're interested in pathology, radiology, cardiology, and so you get exposure to enough exposure to find out what what is your passion for clinical medicine? So that's the overall view of what an MD PhD program entails. There is, like I said, some variation. What they try to do also during this PhD, so that you don't forget your clinical skills, is they'll have some sort of clinical component. So oftentimes it's shadowing, volunteering. So here we do volunteering at the Equal Access Clinic. So that's a free health clinic that's given to the public in Gainesville. So that's an option. And so there's multiple ways that you can kind of keep your clinical skills intact during that PhD training. So I've also provided examples of MD PhD careers. Often people ask me, okay, well, you are doing an MD PhD, what can you do in the future? And so I've decided to show a few people who I've considered as role models, as I learned over time kind of what they do. So there's different forms of careers that you can have. This isn't an exclusive list, and it's also not to say that you have to do an MD PhD program to do these, but these are MD PhD people. So I don't want to say that you have to do an MD PhD to be able to contribute to medicine, but it is one way to contribute. So first, the most traditional route is academics. So you would treat patients in the clinic or in the operating room. You can do research as a principal investigator, and then you would also teach medical students and graduate students in your lab. And so these three things are considered kind of the tenets of academics, and there is some variation depending on what that person's passion is, but that is traditionally what we see. An MD, PhD, and academics would do these three things. And so these people are at a heavily research-funded medical school, so University of Florida, University of Miami, Emory, Harvard, so those kind of medical schools that are heavily research-funded. So one person that's actually here at the University of Florida is Dr. Dwayne Mitchell. So he's an MD, PhD, and he works on immunotherapy. So this is the idea that you can use your own immune system to fight cancer. It's an amazing concept. And so he's the director of the UF Brain Tumor Immunotherapy Program, and so he's trying to do research to be able to use immunotherapy to essentially cure brain cancer. So this is someone who's currently at the University of Florida, and he's just a great person and a great inspiration for a lot of the MD PhD students at UF. So this is someone else I've also looked into, Dr. Kirsten Bibbins Domingo. So she's at University of California in San Francisco, and she's a pioneer for health equity, and she's a cardiovascular epidemiologist. And what she does is a lot of work with cardiovascular disease and helping to improve health equity within cardiovascular diseases. And she has also served as the chair for the United States Preventative Task Force. And what that is essentially a task force that helps clinicians figure out how to determine what are preventative services. So for example, understanding how to do mammograms or how to screen for colorectal cancer. This task force is they're the people who develop these guidelines that the clinicians follow, and so she's a pioneer in that regard as well. So after academics, there's industry. So some people go straight into industry, some transition from academia into industry. And so you can work either in R&D, so research and development, or some people who've transferred in from academia work in administration. So for example, they work as the chief health or chief medical officer. And so there's opportunities working with pharmaceutical companies, working with biotech. So for example, Google has a health division that some physicians are working in now. And you can work in startups. So a lot of a handful of physician scientists do start their own businesses, and they start their own startups and pursue research on their own terms outside of an academic institution. So that's an option for some as well. So someone currently doing this is Dr. Levi Garraway. So he is also a pioneer in the field of cancer genomics, and the idea that we can target certain cancers and use precision medicine to better improve outcomes for cancer patients. So he actually, within the last few weeks, accepted a position at Roche, and he's working as the chief medical officer there and working on product development as well. And so this is an example of a role in industry that an MD PhD can pursue. Lastly, that I'm going to talk about is government. So there are MD PhDs that work in public service to improve public health, and they also can work on developing health policies. So there's a variety of places one can work in government, but these are just a few examples. So the CDC, for example, the NIH, or essentially any division that's under the Department of Health and Human Services. So these are just opportunities in government, again, to serve, to do public service and to help develop health policies to improve outcomes. So an example of this is Dr. David Satcher. You might know him. He, under the Clinton administration, was the Surgeon General as well as the Assistant Secretary for Health. And before that, he was actually the head of the CDC. So he's had quite a number of roles in public service, and he's done a tremendous amount of work for mental health as well as health equity, improving health equity. And so just, again, another example of how you can serve in public service as an MD PhD and improve health outcomes. So hopefully that was a bit of an eye-opener for trying to see what an MD PhD can do, and they're certainly inspirations to me. I do have just a bit of advice that I like to give undergrads whenever I talk to them one-on-one or in a group. So the first thing I advise is to seek mentorship. This can be through a graduate student, a postdoc, or a faculty member. I think that I was able to kind of understand what I was interested in talking to multiple faculty members. And definitely don't be afraid to seek out that mentorship. If one of them says no, that doesn't mean they'll all say no. So I would definitely encourage you to pursue mentorship. And it doesn't have to be local as well. A lot of people, in my experience, have been open to email mentorship as well at other institutions. So I definitely encourage you to seek that out. The second thing is to find what your passion or your purpose is. And I would urge you to try new things and try to figure out what your fit is. If you see something not working for you, don't be afraid to shift. I know a lot of people are afraid to do that. But if I didn't try like going into the business school, I wouldn't have found kind of how I was interested in the inefficiencies of healthcare. So I definitely encourage you to try new things and try to figure out what your passion is, and use this to help drive you as you continue throughout your career. The third thing is don't count yourself out too early. So I didn't think I was going to get accepted into the management program. Again, I'm just a pre-med student. What would they want to do with me? But I really wanted to pursue it, and so I sent the application in, and fortunately they accepted me. And so I've just had the mindset to, even if I'm discouraged or something like that, I still want to apply for as high as I can go. Even if I don't think I'll get it, I still apply, because who knows, they might actually like your application and they see something in you that you don't see in yourself. So I definitely encourage you to cast your net out wide and as far as possible. And then the last thing is to persevere. So if you definitely are interested in an MD PhD program, like that's the one thing that they always tell everyone, you have to be able to persevere. It can range from anywhere from a 7 to 9 year program, and so being able to persevere through that is what's needed to come out on the other side. And then even after that, trying to do residency and then just continue with your career, you need a lot of perseverance. So whether you pursue MD, PhD, or whether you do another career, I still think perseverance is needed to be able to be successful. And also ask for help. So I mentioned finding mentors, but also asking for help if you're having troubles in a class. I know that it's difficult with a lot of mental health issues and being able to find the encouragement to continue. And so definitely ask for help either from your family, either from a professional. I highly encourage everyone to do that if it's needed. So that's all that I have for today, and I'd like to take any questions if there are.